Wyoming Territory, 1887. Nathaniel Cole was 30 years old, 4 months behind on his banknote, and about to be offered the strangest deal of his entire life. He'd inherited the ranch from his uncle 2 years back, a modest 400 acres north of Cheyenne, and had done reasonably well with it until a hard winter took 18 head of cattle, and a spring flood washed out the north pasture fence line clean into the creek. Between the two disasters, he'd fallen behind on the note held by the Cheyenne Territorial Bank, and behind on a banknote in 1887 was not a position a man wanted to occupy for long. He knew the numbers plain as anything. $210 owed, 60 days to pay it, or the bank would take the ranch same as it had taken 3 other spreads in the territory that same year. So when Horace Whitmore, president of the Cheyenne Territorial Bank, rode out to the Cole Ranch himself instead of sending the usual notice by post, Nathaniel understood well enough that something unusual was about to be proposed. "Mr. Cole," Whitmore said, once pleasantries had been exchanged and coffee poured, "I'll come plain to the point, on account of neither of us has patience for dancing around a hard truth. Your note's due, and I've got no particular interest in foreclosing on a ranch that's been worked honest for 2 years running. But I've also got a business to run, and a daughter I'd see settled before I'm too old to enjoy grandchildren." "Sir? My daughter Grace is 24 years old, unmarried, and, if I'm honest, considerably more particular about a suitor's character than his prospects, which has left her without one, despite no shortage of men in this territory who'd take her hand for my money alone. You strike me as an honest man, Mr. Cole, whatever your current troubles. Marry her, and I'll forgive the note entire. $210 gone, and a ranch that stays in your name." Nathaniel sat with that a long moment, turning his coffee cup slow in his hands. "Mr. Whitmore," he said finally, "I appreciate the offer plain as it's given. But I won't marry a woman to settle a debt, whatever the debt costs me. If I ever marry your daughter, it'll be because I chose her honest, not because a banknote forced my hand." Whitmore studied him a long moment, something unreadable crossing his weathered face. "That's either the most foolish thing a man in your position has ever said to me," he said, "or the wisest. I confess I haven't decided which." He left without pressing the matter further, though he left the offer standing, unspoken but understood, hanging in the air between them like a debt of its own kind. Nathaniel sat alone in his kitchen a long while after Whitmore's buggy rolled off, turning the whole proposal over in his mind. He'd heard of arrangements like this before, practical marriages, built on land and debt and family convenience rather than any particular affection, common enough in the territory that nobody thought much to remark on them. His own parents hadn't married for love exactly, though they'd grown into something like it over the years, before the fever took them both inside the same terrible week when Nathaniel was 6 years old. He thought of his Uncle Amos, too, who'd taken him in without a second thought, raised him on this same land, taught him everything a rancher needed to know, and never once remarried after his own wife passed young, saying only that some things weren't worth settling for twice if the first try hadn't been true. Nathaniel had absorbed that particular lesson deep, whether he'd meant to or not, and it was that lesson, more than any particular pride, that had made him turn Whitmore's offer down flat. Nathaniel had no notion, watching Whitmore's buggy roll off down the road, that he'd meet Grace Whitmore herself inside the week, under circumstances that had nothing whatsoever to do with her father's bargain. It happened at the Cheyenne Mercantile, the following Thursday, over a dropped basket of apples. Nathaniel had ridden into town to see about work. A man behind on his note-needed income beyond what the ranch alone could presently provide. And he was coming out of the mercantile just as a young woman coming in collided with him hard enough to send her basket tumbling, apples rolling every direction across the boardwalk. "I do apologize," she said, already crouching to gather them, not waiting on him to offer help first. "No harm done," Nathaniel said, crouching alongside her, gathering apples of his own. "Though I'd wager we've given the whole street something to talk about." She looked up at that, and something in her expression shifted from flustered to faintly amused. "You're Nathaniel Cole. My father mentioned you." His stomach dropped a little, understanding immediately what that mention likely concerned. "I expect he did. He didn't tell me your name on account of thinking I'd approve of the arrangement, if that's what's troubling your face just now. He told me, because I asked him plain who'd turned down $210, rather than marry a stranger for convenience. I wanted to know what kind of fool does that. And what'd you conclude?" "Haven't concluded anything yet. Still gathering evidence." She held up an apple, inspecting it for bruises. "This one's fine if you're wondering." He laughed at that, genuine, surprised out of him despite the circumstances, and helped her finish gathering the rest of the scattered fruit. And something about the ease of the whole exchange, apples and all, struck him as considerably more promising than the stiff, formal courtship he'd have expected from an arrangement built on a bank ledger. That was the whole first contact. No fireworks, just a dropped basket, an honest question, and a woman who wanted evidence before she'd form an opinion about anybody, including a man her own father had all but handed to her. The kindnesses started small, same as they generally do, though both of them were careful, at first, to keep a wary distance from anything that might look like courtship performed for her father's benefit rather than their own. Grace came out to the Cole Ranch the following week, not on any romantic pretense, but because she'd heard through town gossip that Nathaniel had lost most of his kitchen garden to the same flood that took his fence line, and she arrived with a basket of preserves from her own pantry, offered plain as anything. "This isn't charity," she said before he could object. "It's preserves I put up too many of last autumn, same as anybody would share with a neighbor. Don't read anything more into it than that. Wouldn't dream of it," Nathaniel said, though privately he found himself reading a fair amount into it regardless. The second gesture came from Nathaniel a week later, and it concerned a matter Grace hadn't mentioned to him directly at all. He'd heard, through the same reliable channel of small-town gossip, that the Whitmore family's well pump had broken down, leaving Grace and her father hauling water by bucket from the creek a quarter-mile off, a task Whitmore's bad hip made considerably harder than it ought to have been. Nathaniel rode into town with his own tools the following Saturday and fixed the pump himself, without asking payment, without making any particular show of the gesture. "You didn't need to do that," Grace told him, finding him elbow-deep in pump machinery when she came out to see what the commotion in the yard concerned. "Didn't need to, wanted to. Man doesn't like to think of a neighbor hauling water by bucket when a wrench and an hour's work could fix the trouble proper. My father will think you're currying favor toward the arrangement. Your father can think what he likes. I fixed the pump because it needed fixing, same as I'd have done for any neighbor in this territory, arrangement or no arrangement." She didn't have a ready answer for that, and something in the plain honesty of it settled into her chest, in a way she wasn't quite prepared for yet. The next gesture came about a week after that, and it started, oddly enough, with a horse rather than a person. Grace's own mare had thrown a shoe on the road out to the Cole Ranch, forcing her to walk the last mile leading the animal by hand, arriving flustered and travel-worn, in a way that embarrassed her considerably more than the circumstance warranted. Nathaniel said nothing about her appearance, simply fetched his own tools and reshod the mare himself, right there in his yard, while Grace sat on the porch steps recovering from the walk. "You didn't have to do that either," she said, watching him work. "Didn't have to do a great many things I've done these past weeks, Miss Whitmore. Seems to be becoming something of a habit with me. A dangerous habit, some might say, given the circumstances between our families. Might be. Or might just be a man doing what needs doing for somebody he's come to think well of. Arrangement, or no arrangement." He didn't look up from the shoe as he said it, though his ears had gone a touch red at the admission. Grace said nothing further on the matter, but she noticed, riding home that evening on a properly shod mare, that she found herself smiling more than the errand strictly warranted. The third gesture belonged to both of them, in a manner of speaking, and it came about through the Cheyenne schoolhouse, which had lost its only teacher that spring to a sudden marriage out east, leaving a term's worth of children without proper instruction. Grace, who'd been educated well beyond most women in the territory, took up the teaching herself, unpaid, 3 days a week, while the town council searched for a permanent replacement. Nathaniel, hearing of it, and having little enough ranch work to occupy his own days given his depleted herd, took to riding the youngest children home each afternoon in his wagon, on account of several families living too far out for the smaller ones to walk safely alone. "You've made yourself an unofficial member of the school staff," Grace told him one such afternoon, watching him help a 6-year-old boy up into the wagon bed. "Didn't apply for the position, just seemed a fair use of an idle afternoon." "Nothing about you is idle, Nathaniel Cole. I've noticed that much these past weeks." "Noticed a fair amount myself," he said, and didn't elaborate further, though both of them understood plain enough what he meant. "Now, before we continue, I want to thank all of you listening tonight, wherever you're tuning in from. I've heard from folks as far off as Japan and South Africa, and it never stops humbling me how far these old stories manage to travel. Now, back to Nathaniel and Grace. The fourth gesture, quieter than the rest, came from Grace herself. She'd noticed, over the weeks, that Nathaniel kept his late uncle's pocket watch wound faithfully every morning. Though the watch itself had grown so worn, the numbers had faded near past reading, a small daily ritual he performed, without ever mentioning why it mattered. One evening she brought him a small tin of watch polish, and a soft cloth, along with a few careful instructions she'd learned from her own father's habit of maintaining fine timepieces. "Your uncle raised you on this ranch, didn't he?" she said, more statement than question, watching him work the polish carefully into the worn numbers. "After your own folks passed, 6 years old when they took the fever. Uncle Amos took me in without a second thought, raised me proper on this same land, wound that watch every morning of his life, right up until the week he passed. I've kept the habit since, though I couldn't rightly tell you why it matters so much. It matters because it's the last thing you do with your hands, the same way he did with his. That's not a small thing to carry forward, Nathaniel. That's about the finest kind of remembering there is." He didn't say anything for a long moment, the newly polished watch face catching lamplight in his rough hands. "That's about the kindest thing anybody's said to me about him since he passed," he said finally. "Wasn't trying to be kind, was trying to be honest. Sometimes those look the same from the outside." It was one of Nathaniel's youngest wagon passengers, a girl named Clara Beth, 7 years old, who said the plain truth neither adult had managed. Riding home one afternoon, squeezed onto the wagon bench between Nathaniel and Grace, who'd stayed late grading slates, and needed a ride home herself that particular day. Clara Beth looked between the two adults with the directness only a 7-year-old possesses and said, "Are you two gonna get married? My mama says the whole town's waiting to find out." Grace nearly dropped the slate she was holding. "Clara Beth, that's not a proper question." "Why not? Everybody talks about it at church. Mrs. Fenwick says it'd solve the whole debt business tidy, and Mr. Ashford says you two look sweet on each other, regardless of any debt at all." Nathaniel kept his eyes carefully on the road ahead, though a flush had crept up from his collar considerable. Folks ought to mind their own business a bit more than they do. "That's not an answer either," Clara Beth pointed out, with the merciless logic only children seem to possess, and went back to swinging her legs off the wagon bench like she hadn't just named, out loud, the exact question both adults had been carefully avoiding for weeks. Neither Nathaniel nor Grace managed a proper response to that. But something had been said plain that both of them had been dancing around, and neither one of them could quite manage to unhear it. The direct ask came from Nathaniel, and it came on an evening about 2 months after that basket of apples first tumbled across the mercantile boardwalk. He found Grace on her father's porch, mending a torn hem by lamplight, and he stood there a moment working up the nerve before he finally spoke. "I need to say something plain, and I'd appreciate you letting me finish before you answer. On account of I've been circling this thought the better part of a week. I'm listening. Your father offered to forgive my debt if I married you. I turned that offer down flat, and I'd turn it down again 100 times over, because I never wanted a wife bought with somebody else's money, least of all yours. But somewhere in the 2 months since, working alongside you and fixing that pump and watching you teach children that aren't yours with more patience than most mothers manage for their own, I've fallen in love with you, plain and true, debt or no debt. I'm asking you to marry me, Grace Whitmore, not for $210, and not for your father's blessing, but because I can't imagine building a life on this ranch without you standing beside me building it too. Grace set down her needle, and the quiet stretched long enough that Nathaniel's stomach had time to sink clean through the porch boards before she finally spoke. I've been waiting the better part of 2 months for you to say that plain, she said. I'd have said yes to the arrangement my father proposed, if you'd asked outright that first week, because I'd have found a way to make peace with it eventually. But I'm glad, more glad than I can rightly say, that you waited until it was true instead. Word of the engagement reached Grace's cousin Louisa in Denver within the month, and Louisa, who fancied herself considerably more sophisticated than her Cheyenne relations, arrived by stage the following week with strong opinions about the whole affair. There's a Mr. Theodore Lang in Denver, Louisa said, over supper at the Whitmore table. Recently arrived from Boston, managing his family's mining investments. Asked after you specifically when you visited last spring, Grace. A man of considerable means, and considerably more polish than a rancher 4 months behind on his note. I'm aware of Mr. Lang, Louisa. I danced with him once. He remembers you fondly. Could offer you a house in Denver proper, servants, a life free of ranch work and debt worries entirely. Whitmore, seated at the head of the table, said nothing, watching the exchange with the careful neutrality of a man who'd already made his own peace with the matter weeks back. Louisa, Grace said, calm as anything. Do you know what Nathaniel did the week our well pump broke? I couldn't say. Fixed it himself, without being asked, without accepting a cent for the labor, because he heard my father was hauling water by bucket with a bad hip. Do you know what he's been doing 3 afternoons a week since our school teacher left? I don't see what relevance. Driving children home from school in his own wagon, unpaid, because several families live too far for the youngest ones to walk safely alone. That's not the gesture of a man chasing my father's money, Louisa. My father offered him $210 to marry me, and he turned it down flat, said he'd never marry a woman bought with somebody else's debt. He proposed to me 2 months later for love alone, after the arrangement had already been refused, and forgotten by everybody but me. Mr. Lang remembers one dance in Denver. Nathaniel Cole fixed a pump, taught himself to wind a dead man's watch every morning out of love, and drove half this town's children home from school without once asking to be thanked for it. I know exactly which man I'm choosing, Louisa, and I'd choose him again every single time you asked. Louisa sat with that a long moment, fork untouched, glancing toward her uncle for support that plainly wasn't coming. You always were stubborn, Grace, she said finally, though something in her voice had softened considerable. Learned it honest, Louisa. Same place I learned everything else. Louisa left on the Tuesday stage. Whitmore, for his part, said nothing further about Mr. Lang, and settled Nathaniel's remaining debt quietly the following week regardless of the engagement, calling it, when Nathaniel tried to object, a father's wedding gift, and not a condition of anything, so you'll kindly stop arguing with me about it. But Whitmore hadn't left that particular conversation before saying one more thing to his daughter, alone, once Louisa had retired for the evening. I confess I hoped for this outcome the whole while, he admitted, gruff. The way men of his generation admitted to hoping for anything at all. Though I'd never have forced it, whatever Louisa might imagine about a father's motives. I know that, Papa. I offered him the arrangement thinking it might save you both some trouble finding your way to each other, if the fondness was already there waiting to be found. I didn't expect him to refuse it flat, mind you. Took me by surprise. A man turning down $210 on principle alone. That surprised me too, if I'm honest. It shouldn't have, Whitmore said, something almost fond in his usually careful voice. A man who'd refuse easy money for the sake of doing right by you is exactly the kind of man I always hoped you'd find, Grace. I just never expected my own bank ledger to be the instrument that introduced you. Grace said nothing to that, but she hugged her father then, longer than either of them was accustomed to, and neither one felt any particular need to say more about the matter after that. I chose this, Grace told Nathaniel that evening, once her cousin's stage had rolled out of sight down the road. Wanted you to know it was a real choice, same as you insisted it needed to be. I looked hard at the easier road Louisa laid out plain enough, and I picked the harder one anyway, and I'd pick it again every single time. Why? Nathaniel asked, though he thought he already knew. Because of a well pump fixed for free, because of children driven home from school, 3 afternoons a week, by a man who had no obligation to any of them, because you turned down $210 rather than let a debt decide something that ought to have been decided by love alone. You never gave me one grand gesture in the 2 months I've known you, Nathaniel Cole. You gave me 100 small honest ones instead, and I'll take that over every mining fortune in Denver, every single time. $210, he said, half a laugh catching rough in his throat. That's what your father offered to forgive if I married you. Turned it down flat, and somehow ended up with you anyway. Debt settled besides, though I never once asked for that part. That's what happens when you choose the harder road, honest Nathaniel. Sometimes the easier road finds its way to you regardless. Once it's clear, you never wanted it handed to you in the first place. They married that October, at the Cole Ranch itself, under an old cottonwood that Nathaniel's uncle had planted the same year he'd taken in a 6-year-old boy, who'd lost everything else in the world worth keeping. Clara Beth stood at the front, holding the ring on a small cushion Grace herself had stitched, prouder than any 7-year-old had a right to be. Having correctly named the whole matter, a full 2 months before either adult managed to say it plain. Grace wore a simple cream-colored dress, practical enough to help with ranch work the following week if called upon, and Nathaniel wore his uncle's old watch on a chain across his vest, wound faithfully that very morning, the numbers worn but the hands keeping steady, honest time. Whitmore gave a short toast at the wedding supper, declaring, with more warmth than anybody had expected from a banker, known mostly for his careful ledgers, that he'd never in his career made a worse business proposal or a better decision than riding out to the Cole Ranch that spring, and nobody in attendance disputed either claim. The wedding supper itself was simple: roast beef, fresh bread, and a cake Clara Beth's mother had insisted on baking as her own contribution to the celebration, declaring that any girl clever enough to name the whole romance months before the adults managed it deserved a family that celebrated properly. Nobody argued the logic, and the cake, by all accounts, turned out considerably finer than anyone had expected. From a recipe tested only twice beforehand, Nathaniel kept the small tin of watch polish Grace had first brought him, mostly empty now, tucked in a drawer beside his uncle's watch, and never mentioned to her that he'd kept it. She found it there years later, and never told him she'd found it either, and that small tin became its own quiet monument to an evening a careful kindness had turned, slow and sure, into something considerably larger than either of them had expected. 6 years later, the Cole Ranch had recovered well past its old numbers by then, 60 head of cattle, a proper new fence line along the north pasture that had never washed out again, and 2 children, a boy of 4 and a girl not yet 2. Grace still taught at the schoolhouse 2 days a week, now alongside a proper hired teacher the town council had finally secured, and Clara Beth, 13 now, had taken to helping with the youngest students most afternoons, following in the very footsteps she'd once ridden home in Nathaniel's wagon. Whitmore visited most Sundays, doting on his grandchildren with a warmth few in Cheyenne would have believed possible from the same man who'd once run the Territorial Bank with such careful, unsentimental precision. One evening that autumn, Nathaniel found Grace sitting beneath the old cottonwood, watch in her lap, having taken over the winding duty herself some years back. On the mornings his own hands were too full with ranch work to manage it. "Still keeping honest time?" he asked, settling beside her. "Best it ever has. Your uncle would be pleased, I think, knowing it's still being wound faithful all these years later. Sounds like a story about more than just a watch." "Reckon it is," she said, closing the watch case and slipping her hand into his instead. A man turns down easy money because he wants something true instead, and finds out true costs more up front, but pays back a whole lot more besides. That the lesson you took from all this? That's the lesson. Took your father-in-law considerably longer to learn it than either of us, if I'm honest. Though he got there eventually. They sat there together beneath the cottonwood a long while, watching their children chase each other through the trees' lengthening shadow. The ranch settled quiet and steady around them, built from a refused bargain, an honest apple basket, and a debt that had, in the end, disappeared anyway, not because a marriage bought it off, but because love, given the chance, tends to settle far more than it costs. Their son came running up just then, 4 years old, and clutching a wooden toy horse Whitmore had carved him the previous Christmas, declaring he meant to be a rancher same as his papa when he grew tall enough to ride proper. "Fine ambition," Nathaniel said, lifting the boy onto his lap. "Though I'll warn you, son, ranching's harder work than it looks from a porch swing. Grandpa says you're the best rancher in the whole territory." Grandpa's biased, seeing as he's the one who nearly talked me into marrying his daughter for $210, and got considerably more than he bargained for out of the whole arrangement. Grace laughed at that, easy and warm, the same laugh that had first caught his attention over a basket of tumbled apples 6 years back, and their daughter toddled over to join them, and the 4 of them stayed there beneath the old cottonwood until the light went fully gold and then fully dim, in no particular hurry to be anywhere else in the whole of Wyoming territory. Now, friends, if you've stayed with me this whole way through, I thank you for it truly. Here's the plain lesson I carry away from Nathaniel and Grace's story. The easy path and the true path aren't always opposites, though they can look that way at first glance. Nathaniel could have taken the easy road, married for convenience, settled his debt, called it good sense. Instead he chose the harder, truer road, and found out, in time, that the easy road had a way of finding him regardless. Once it was clear, he'd never wanted it handed to him cheap. If you're facing a choice between what's easy and what's true, I hope this story reminds you that true is always worth the wait, even when it costs you more up front than easy ever would. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. Until next time, keep listening.